to get a UN sanctions renewed against Iran. They were defeated last Saturday because, or Friday, I can't remember which one it was. The only countries that voted with them, as Moshe pointed out, was the Dominican Republic. For a hegemon power, that's something. If the only countries that vote with you is the Dominican Republic. The European countries, China, Russia, I think everybody else voted against it. So today they're going to attempt at what is called snapback. And we're now getting to know all sorts of new words in the US and UN dialogue. Snapback is basically saying, okay, we've voted out, but we're coming back. And they're going to try and reimpose what they consider to be necessary sanctions. One of the accusations is bizarre. It's because Iran is not adhering to the nuclear deal. Well, who left the nuclear deal is the first question I would ask. Even John Bolton, who normally is quite gung-ho about these kind of things, is saying this is not a good idea. This will not work. So I'll speak at the end a little bit more about this last phase of the current presidency of Trump, because unlike some people, I'm not quite sure if he will go. But I will start with the period just before Trump's election. And I think the one thing we should remember is that it really most comrades know, but I just need to go through it all over again, is the whole Iran nuclear deal of the last year of Obama's presidency, after 2 years of intensive negotiations and quite a lot of people working towards it, the European Union, Russia, China, whoever. That deal was extremely unpopular in Israel and with neoconservatives. Inevitably, their main enemy was being, if you like, reinstalled as not an ally, but no longer a hostile enemy. And if you go back to those years, it's important to remember that towards the end of Obama's presidency, the Obama-Netanyahu relationship fell to an all-time low. Now, this doesn't mean, and I emphasize here, this doesn't mean the Democratic Party has any negative relations with Israel. In fact, historically, they have been quite close. It's just the dynamics of the Iran deal, the fact that Obama wasn't supporting everything Netanyahu wanted to do, that created this all-time low in the US-Israeli relationship. Trump's election promises were contradictory from the very beginning. On the one hand, he kept saying no costly interventions abroad. At the same time, he was talking about making America great again. And I might be wrong because I don't live in the US, but my understanding was that making America great again had quite a lot to do with the concept of, if you like, what neoconservatives, such as the Republican neoconservatives, such as Bannon, Bolton, considered as his recent humiliations of the United States. By recent, I mean actually a few decades old, but the embassy siege in Iran, the removal of the Shah, an ally of the United States, more importantly, maybe the failure of the CIA to be able to release the hostages. There were a couple of disasters. One of them was a US helicopter landed, didn't have enough fuel and crashed in the desert. These are important because if you read Bannon's memoirs, for example, it's a significant factor in his adherence to the ideas that one of the main tasks of the Trump administration is to change the regime in Iran. So making America great for these people, as far as I could see, was taking revenge, taking back a position where the United States would be more powerful. You have to add to this the paranoia, both in Israel but also in Saudi Arabia, about the growing influence of the Islamic Republic in the region. I'll talk quite a bit about that later, but let us not forget at this stage that the Islamic Republic's influence in the region was a direct consequence of US interventions in the region. It didn't happen accidentally. Whether they knew what they were doing, I'm not going into it, but anyway, that was a direct consequence of US intervention. In power, the declared foreign policy statement of the US of the Trump administration, that has, if you like, remained more or less constant, was not first withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, which they did as they had promised. This was part of the election promise, but also the subsequent gradual and at times extensive extension of sanctions. You could say in some ways that's been a consistent policy of the Trump administration. In May 2017, I don't know, you must remember, there was this meeting in Saudi Arabia, there was this globe that lit up. It was the opening of, I need to get the name right, the Global Center for Combating Extremist Ideology. And those present were the ones who actually held the globe initially, and then there were some other Persian Emirates, Persian Gulf emirs who were also around. But there was Sisi, King Salman, both of them looking quite fierce, actually. Trump looking quite idiotic, and his wife. Now, I do want to spend some time about fighting extremism in the Gulf. The reasons are that it's not just that this center is ironic, it's just this whole concept that we have to fight Iran because it's leading terrorism in the region is basically fake news. As an opponent of the Islamic Republic, I don't like false allegations against the Islamic Republic. There are many allegations, and I will talk about its internal policies, but this particular one is nonsense. So again, I need to go very quickly through some significant periods. 9/11, September 2001. All the people who did the action were Saudis. They had been trained, they were jihadis, they had been trained in Afghanistan. They were supported by the Taliban. All of these had their background directly connected to Saudi Arabia. There's no doubt about it. I don't think this is a fact that anyone disputes. Just before September 2001, Islamic Republic of Iran almost went to war with the Taliban on Iran's support for the Northern Alliance and the fact that the Taliban saw this as interference in their internal affairs. In fact, Iran's Islamic Republic, and we now know from memoirs, from documents published by US generals, not least by General Croker, that Iran's military, including General Qasemi, who was assassinated earlier this year, did their best to help the US war efforts in 2001 as it launched attacks on the Taliban. A leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard shared maps of where they saw Taliban strongholds were with the US military. This is important because my whole argument is that Iran makes a lot of anti-US rhetoric, but we should be careful as why that is happening. In 2003, again, when the US went to attack Saddam Hussein, for some people, like the Israeli leaders, like Bolton, US went for the wrong target. They should have gone to attack Iran. And in fact, they openly said that. One of the reasons this didn't happen was clearly because for Bush, it was revenge for the Kuwait situation, betrayal of a former loyal servant, Saddam Hussein, who had actually gone to war with the blessing of the United States against Iran's Islamic Republic. What did they do? As a result of this 2003 war, again, something that I'm sure in Tehran, if they had champagne bottles and they weren't teetotals, they would have opened champagne bottles. The Shia opposition, who had been trained, who had been in exile in Iran, came to power in Iraq. So overnight, a pro-US secular dictatorship, Saddam Hussein, let's not forget he was a dictator, was replaced by a Shia-led government, which was quite friendly to the Islamic Republic. Some of the, especially amongst the initial leaders of the Islamic Republic, many had their center of guidance, marja taqlid, which means as a Shia, you follow an Ayatollah. Their marja taqlid was in Qom, was not in Karbala, was not in Najaf. These people had lived in Iran for so long, some of them were very closely associated with the Shia clergy. So to cut a long story short, we got to a situation where I'm passing through a lot of stuff here, civil war in Iraq, Arab Spring and so on, but we ended up with a situation that both for the Saudis, but also for the Kuwaitis, for the United Arab Emirates, the situation was unbearable. A Shia republic, Iran's Islamic Republic, now had allies, not all of them necessarily of the same religious tendencies, but Lebanon on the one hand, is Syria to a certain extent, at that stage maybe a lot less than it later became an ally, and then Iraq. And the paranoia of Saudi Arabia is both understandable, but also had consequences. The consequences were this formation, what we saw the beginning of what became the Arab-Israeli alliance against Iran. Now, a lot is said about the United Arab Emirates' recent open deals with Israel. I'm arguing that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There has been a lot of negotiations, a lot of deals between Israel and the and most of these Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia over the last few years, especially during Trump's administration. I think this drove the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, initially maybe not at the government level. I can't make accusations at government level because I don't know, but clearly at the level of very senior, very influential and very wealthy Saudis, Kuwaitis, Emiratis, to throw funds at jihadists. Throwing funds at jihadists at what they had originally started, the Muslim Brotherhood in some countries, the Al-Qaeda Iraq, as the remnants of both the Ba'athists, but the Sunni population who were very angry at the Shia, at the way the Shia-led government, as far as they were concerned, was a sectarian government, moving them completely out of power. And this money went, as I said, first to maybe Iraqi Al-Qaeda, that became IS, that became ISIS, then became ISIL. And in all of these movements, when you look at all these actions, they are not just about, they have nothing to do with Shia Sunni. It is to do with competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. There are proxy wars about Saudi Arabia and Iran. Yes, you can use the religious ideological wordings to get people recruited to fight Shia militias in Iraq, but that doesn't mean you actually believe it. And in that way, I think the main competitions were geopolitical reasons, political influence, the fact that Iran could become a power in the region. And in this we have For this, you don't have to take my word. WikiLeaks has actually released tapes, audio tapes, videotapes of both Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, making comments to congressmen, to people around the Senate, that the funding for all of these organizations leans back to Saudi Arabia. Now, one news agency did a fact check for one of these, on whether Saudi Arabia was involved, whether the Persian Gulf countries were involved. And my only suggestion, I think it's Channel 4, my only suggestion is you read the reply from the Saudi ambassador. It is so funny. It really, you don't need any proof after that, right? So basically it's saying, oh, we can't control our citizens. Maybe the odd person has done this. This is a country where people can't breathe without Ben Salman putting them in prison. So don't tell me you didn't know. Then I think all of this gives you an idea of why those of us who do know anything about the Middle East found the Global Center to Combat Extremist Ideology very ironic in 2017. This was the first public step for what was to become the Kushner Trump plan for the Middle East, a New Deal. They were also, amongst all these other things, including, not said openly, but clearly on the agenda, regime change in Iran. They were going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue. All these presidents had failed, Kerry had failed, but Trump was going to deliver that. And I suppose one culmination of that was the annexation policies announced earlier this year, which were supposed to happen in July. They were delayed or suspended, or there is an exchange. We don't know, but everyone says different things about this. But anyway, as a result of this, we have this strange situation where basically the Israelis are hoping to make deal one by one with a number of Arab countries, maybe before November 2020, the last one being Saudi Arabia itself. I'll talk a lot about this at the end. So, again, throughout this period, we have had, both before the Trump became president, but during his presidency, occasions where he has made comments, derogatory and sometimes racist comments about Arabs, about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wouldn't last more than 2 weeks if the US withdrew its support. However, none of this has stopped sale of arms to the Saudis, has stopped recruiting and sending people to train Saudi pilots. No event, including the war in Yemen or the crude assassination of Khashoggi, has cooled down this US-Saudi relationship. And this is important because Saudi Arabia plays a crucial role in Trump's policy for regime change. I suppose one of the ideas of making America great but not spending any money is to actually get other people to pay for your regime change. And in this case, Saudi Arabia, paranoid about events in the region, paranoid about the growing influence of Iran, and Israel have been very generous with trying their cultural efforts on the poor Iranian people. Saudis are clearly financing both the royalists, the ex-Shah's allies, supporters, and the Mujahideen. There is also, in my mind, no doubt that Israel is supporting indirectly some of these efforts. There must be coordination. Some of this expresses itself in the form of TV stations, some of it in the forms of actually financing staff for these exiled opposition groups. However, it's interesting that 3 years and almost 9 months into the presidency of Trump, regime change hasn't worked. Now, Bolton, in his memoirs and in recent interviews, I suppose regretting, compared to the success of 1953, he's saying the biggest failure of Trump's foreign policy has been his lack of ability to achieve regime change in Iran. I would say that's probably an exaggeration, but that is a fact. Unless they achieve it in the next 3 months, and I find that difficult to believe, that would be something they were determined to do, and they didn't manage to do it. What is this maximum pressure that Trump goes on about? So he constantly talks about maximum pressure, and Pompeo goes on about it. It's not just sanctions by US firms who have left the nuclear deal. So there's a straightforward situation. You are in a deal, you leave the deal, sanctions are imposed. They have stopped other countries who remained in the Iran nuclear deal, including the European community, China, Russia, to make any deals with Iran. And they've made it extremely expensive for these countries to do any deals. I give you some examples. Car manufacturers had to leave Iran, such as Benz. Mercedes-Benz had a bus assembly plant, Citroën, Peugeot, Saipa, South Korean. They all had to leave for 2 reasons. One was the US was imposing heavy penalties on any company that did a deal with Iran. So you could face secondary sanctions. Some of these were bizarre. I really couldn't understand the rationale of what you would do it. But soon after 1 or 2 of these were imposed, in fact, multinationals made their own decision, and their own decision was very clear. If we deal with Iran, we might lose our US market. So if you're Citroën or Peugeot, of course you would lose Iran. You would withdraw your plant. You would stop any activity. Banking got even more bizarre. So the accusation was that the official and unofficial foreign exchange bureaus in the Islamic Republic were used for money laundering by the Revolutionary Guards, by the Khas-Daran. And the government's approach to this was to basically stop any money or freeze any account that received any money from Iran. Some of my relatives have children abroad. They were sending money because their child is a student, their son is a student, their daughter is working. And all of these accounts, together with millions of Iranians out in Europe and the US, including in this country, were frozen to such an extent where you actually didn't want to send money even between relatives because you were worried that your account might also get frozen. And it shows the financial, more than anything else, I think, it shows the financial power of the United States in that it controls transactions. So its agencies could pick up any transaction coming out of Iran's Islamic Republic. And one of the excuses they gave was that these foreign exchange bureaus might have sent the money to your son or daughter who wasn't involved in the Revolutionary Guard, but the reals that were exchanged in Iran were mixed with reals that were dirty money, if you like, associated with the Islamic Republic. So in a way, I think the example, especially of finance and banking, showed the unbelievable, in my view, unprecedented power of the United States in doing, in controlling the economy. So, of course, as these companies left Iran, and as these banking situations became worse, the currency collapsed. The currency was falling by, you would buy 7,000 tumans, used to buy $1. Then it became 14,000 in literally a couple of months after the Iran deal. The government put a lot of reserves into the country's economy, into the central bank to rescue the currency. Maximum pressure brought a new level of sanctions on X, Y, Z. They were adding to it all the time. The currency went further down. And as a result of this, we had a situation where I think now 20,000 tumans are $1, which is quite considerable if you think that this is less than 3.5 years. So the Trump administration's achievement in terms of breaking down an economy, whatever you think of it, you could say have worked. They were also considering, with Israel and Saudi Arabia, the issue of attacking Iran. From Bolton's memory, we know that this was regularly on the agenda. Now, ironically, it was General Mad Dog Mattis, according to Bolton's memoirs, who stopped this. He said, this is madness. You can't go. If you do that, you'll be stuck in a war that would make Iraq look like a storm in a teacup. Don't do it. And eventually, I think by the looks of things, generals and the military stopped Trump from launching a war. Again, Bannon, Bolton, Mattis are all history. As we all know, for various reasons, they fell out with Trump or Trump fell out with them, and they're all gone. They're all history. By last September, we were in a situation where Trump was very keen for a deal with the Islamic Republic. And there we see a very bizarre situation. He wanted, it was so obvious, it wasn't even hidden diplomacy. He wanted a photo opportunity with Rouhani even if it was in the corridors of the United Nations, as the General Assembly, the leaders of various countries were in New York. Iran wanted a deal, and I'll come back to why Iran needed a deal, but also doesn't care about the deal. But Iran needed a secret deal. Iran couldn't be seen just on a photo opportunity where the photo opportunity would mean nothing, a one-page statement like what Trump achieved with the North Korean leader. And then that one page is really meaningless, as we saw in reality as the issues developed. So the meeting didn't happen, although, as I say, there were really high-level negotiations. There was a lot of mediation by various people, but the actual meeting didn't happen. However, having said all that, there is no doubt that maximum pressure has made the government unpopular, more unpopular, I would say, than it was before. There are very good reasons for it. In a serious economic condition, they actually did the last of IMF's requests, which was to remove subsidies on fuel. November 2019, we saw riots. Those riots had very good reason. The poor, the urban poor, live off, if you like, casual jobs that can only happen if you have, if you can use trucks to drive things, if you can drive passengers and so on, but also the removal of the subsidy on fuel increased food prices in Iran and created riots for very good reasons. The Islamic Republic obviously blames the US for all its economic problems. But in this second part, I want to argue why this isn't simply the sanctions problems. And here, I think we need to look at the economy of the Islamic Republic from the late 1980s. We saw after the end of the Iran-Iraq war, what was heralded as reconstruction, rebuilding. This was a good idea, obviously, after an 8-year war, but it required money. And this is when Iran approached international organizations. Now, those who know about the Islamic clergy would have no illusions about the relationship between the clergy and the bazaar, the relationship between the clergy and landowning classes historically in the Middle East, and the fact that the last thing they are after is socialism or equality. The slogans of Iran's revolution were radical for very good reason. They were radical because the movement from below was asking for economic demands, had economic demands. I remember bread, job, freedom was one of them. Non-kar azadi was one of the slogans of 79. But the Islamic leaders didn't have that. And sorry, if in the early years, Khomeini himself appeared to be questioning aspects of, if you like, the extravagances of capitalism under the Pahlavi era, by 1990s, that was history. No one was talking about that. Remember, also, Iran embraced the collapse of the Soviet Union as a major victory. There is no more this threat that they had foreseen, they had seen amongst opposition groups inside their own country of people defending socialism, communism, as far as the regime was concerned. This was the establishment, the time where these major industrial complexes were created. Some were state-owned, some were public-owned, some were private-public. And increasingly, as you look at Iran, the private sector is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the public sector is getting smaller. In this, there are lots of statistics, lots of figures that could show that. You could also say that in the private sector, there are sectors that are nominally owned by government institutions, such as, or military institutions, more likely, such as the Revolutionary Guard. But even amongst those, then individuals within those organizations become major capitalists, major shareholders. Some of the new enterprises took the name foundation, but again, I want people to be aware that foundations didn't remain as foundation. Sorry. By 2000, the government had some problems. There were economic problems with these mixed economies where the expectation of the private sector was growing. And the state actually made the decision to, if you like, relinquish even more authority. It's 2004. Khamenei made a historic statement in which he changed the constitution of the Islamic Republic. This is unprecedented. A leader does it. This constitution was supposed to have been voted by a silly referendum, but the leader changes it, where he accepts that 80% of state-owned assets, industries, sections of the economy can be privatized. By now, we are talking of 90% of Iran's economy having been privatized. I think if they could, they would privatize the Revolutionary Guard, is my opinion, but we'll see. So the major factions of the Islamic Republic then started competing in this newly privatized sector. And they gained both their power in terms of who will have the presidential post or the Speaker of the Parliament post, based on how much financial influence they could gain within these organizations. We are also talking of this period where the IMF is giving loans to Iran. These loans have very heavy interest rates. The country isn't able to return these loans, and the pressure is increasing on most ordinary Iranians. We are seeing throughout this period the growing formation of conglomerates. So a car company such as Saipa is involved in banking, which is completely acceptable and understandable capitalist strategy. But in the case of Iran, some of these lead to major disasters later. Saipa has a bank. The car manufacturer Iran Khodro has its own banking financial structure. And successive governments, and I emphasize successive governments, from Rafsanjani to Khatami to Ahmadinejad, Ahmadinejad who presented himself as the defender of the poor, the disinherited, to Rouhani, have presided over not just the privatization of the state sector, but the growth of these major industries, major companies. Some of the loans that the banks were giving to these big, these private banks were giving loans to the large conglomerates. According to some of the government's own assessments, 40% of them were unsafe. And if you think of how that led to the 2008-2009 crisis, you talk about a country where there are sanctions, there is international pressure, you can see the economic effects as you go on. Why do we know about the factions' involvement in these conglomerates and the inevitable corruption that it created? It's because of the trials that the Islamic Republic has put on in the last few years. So every president who comes to power tries the corruption of the faction before him. Ahmadinejad did quite a bit about the Khatami era, but at that time we were still talking of small money. Rouhani started his presidency by putting on trial allies of Ahmadinejad, including his son-in-law, and a number of ministers of Ahmadinejad era who were involved in very serious fraud and corruption, all associated with these large conglomerates. The advent of Ayatollah Raisi as the new judge, he's head of judiciary now, replacing a softer, maybe milder Larijani, has meant that even when Rouhani is president, we are seeing corruption trials against, for example, his brother. And sanctions have actually added the dimensions of this economic corruption, because inevitably sanctions means imports are very expensive, exports are cheap. The state, anyone associated with any part of the state can get access to a different rate of exchange, and therefore can become rich, if you like, very quickly. There are talks about all these Ponzi deals that Iranian clerics got involved to become super rich. I would say you don't need that. All you have to do is to be the distributor of an item which is not available on the market, that sanctions have made it expensive. I believe Rouhani's son-in-law is considered to be the king of bananas. And I kept asking people, what does it mean that he's king of bananas? And it means he has the sole distribution and purchase of bananas. And that's made him a multi-millionaire. However, some of the allies of Ahmadinejad, who some people call him the Trump of Iran, because of his populist, I am the man of the people type of rhetoric, some of the allies of Ahmadinejad are involved in what can only be called multi-billion-dollar corruption cases. The supreme leader himself is head of one of these foundations. Now, you could say maybe his foundation is helping, I don't know, the disinherited, whatever Islamic terms there is for the poor. That's not quite true, because we know from leaks from within those circles that at least his son is benefiting personally, financially, from the money estimated by Reuters, maybe wrong, but at $95 billion. Khamenei is an important figure because he is the supreme leader of the country, and we can't talk about Iran and Iran's relations with Trump without talking about Khamenei. But I think he's either a very good liar, and I would go for saying that he's a good liar, or he's completely deluded. I listen constantly to him. Whenever he gives a long speech, I listen to everything he says. And in his own opinion, he thinks he's a leader of a non-aligned religious state, where people are, generally speaking, quite pious. They're adherents of Shia religion. He believes there is a level of democracy in that, at least if you are part of the establishment, i.e., you accept that Iran is an Islamic republic, you're not calling for the secularism, you're not calling for socialism, there is democracy. On this, I would say, okay, Iran is a particular type of dictatorship. Factions that are loyal to the Islamic Republic are definitely free to express themselves, depending on how much money they have at the time and what do they control. Do they control the TV station? Do they control a paper? Everybody else has to shut up, basically. And I know that it's easy to accuse, nowadays it's the method of the government to accuse anybody who says anything to be an agent of the CIA. That's not true. He thinks that he's leading such a country. Well, first of all, it is a very 1970s idea, this non-aligned state. Non-aligned states existed because the Soviet Union existed. They disappeared after that. And then we've had global capitalism. Iran has been part of global capitalism, and so on. When it comes to Shia adherence, I don't know what his advisors tell him, but anyone with any knowledge of Iranian society will tell you that Iranian society, the generations born after 1979, are the most anti-Islamic, on average, the most anti-Islamic generation of the Middle East. They don't want Islam, they like drinking. Prohibition has made them more eager to drink. Forced segregation of sexes has made them more eager to have mixed parties. They listen and watch the international media. And in some ways, the low culture that existed in the Islamic Republic has played its role in the kind of political trashy invasion of Saudi-type TV stations, radio stations, pro-Israeli propaganda going to the country, and that has made the situation worse. Okay, so if you have, for example, Saudis organizing culture shows for you, you can imagine the level of culture goes further down, or Israelis inviting California exiled Iranian singers to TV stations that are broadcasting to Iran, then you really bring the culture even further. But some of it is really trashy. It's pornographic, it's semi-pornographic. And what the Supreme Leader and his close allies don't seem to realize is that prohibition has made these even more popular, but also the abolition of proprietary, the censorship of books and so on, has paved the way for this. You can find libraries, you can find bookshops, translation is thriving in Iran and so on, but this doesn't cover the whole of the country and the whole of the population. So the base was there for this, what I would call Saudi invasion of Iranian households through these horrible TV stations. And I think the gap between the rich and the poor, which was one of the demands of the February uprising, has grown considerably. I don't think you can say this is the same level of gap between rich and poor that it was during the Shah. It's far worse. Okay, the world economy has reached a situation where globally we see that gap increasing dramatically, as Piketty has shown. But I think in Iran that is shows its face in a really horrible way. For example, you have shanty towns right next to luxury housing developments where relatives of leaders of the regime or those associated with senior ayatollahs, people in Iran call them aghazadeh, sons of ayatollahs, have built houses where the staircase is painted with gold, where in some restaurants in Iran, you can order ice cream that has gold dust on it. This is the way, if you like, a revolution has deteriorated to this stage where you have this kind of thing. And then there is, of course, next to it, people who are either working three very low paid jobs during 6 hours here, 8 hours there, then driving a taxi to earn some money, or haven't got any of these and are begging in the street, or are deprived of livelihood and everything else. It's inevitable that such a gap has created anger. You can't, if you talk to young Iranians, mainly working class young Iranians, you cannot avoid hearing anger at what is happening in the country. And this anger expresses itself occasionally in demonstrations, but the state's attitude to this is to repress it. The state's attitude is to arrest anyone that is in the demonstration. Workers go on strike because they haven't been paid for months as a result, direct result of privatization. For example, Haftape workers, I have some photos of their recent demonstration. Their demand is very clear. Remove the privatization, take us back into state ownership. But the state's incapability to respond to any of these means they then arrest everyone. Mayday protesters, workers, no connection with anyone else. You're clear who these people are arrested, accused of being foreign agents of foreign powers. This doesn't mean I'm saying every political prisoner in Iran isn't an agent of CIA. There are those who work for the CIA or who are paid by the CIA or by Saudi Arabia. But the majority, the overwhelming majority of those prisoners have nothing to do with this. It's just people arrested on the street, their lawyer arrested because she or he defended them, and so on. So we have a very difficult situation, basically, in all of this. And I think people are also angry because they see that, or at least they hear, whether they like it or not, from the international media, that their country is spending a lot of money in Syria, in Lebanon, is involved in wars. On this, I have said, and I repeat the case, there is a case for leaders of the Islamic Republic to be paranoid. They have the superpower against them, the two powerful allies of the United States, Saudi Arabia and Israel against them. So it's fair enough for them to think that. And they were spending, as I tried to explain, for ISIS, for IS, and all the rest of it. But having said that, if you are a worker and you're a government employee sometimes, and you haven't been paid for 6 months, if you're someone whose firm was privatized because the state said, oh, we have to, we can't carry on carrying these industries like Haftar workers, then you hear about all these expenditures in other countries. It's inevitable that you become very anti-Iran's involvement abroad. So in the demonstrations, we do hear, I think it's anyone who's been into these demonstrations wouldn't tell you, we do hear slogans, leave Syria alone, leave Lebanon alone, what about us, from workers, from ordinary people. I have my own views on that. I think, just to finish, the next 3-4 months will be crucial, both for Iran and for the Middle East. Contrary to both regime change supporters on the right, but also some leftists who support the ideas that maybe we should try and get rid of this government at any cost, and even the left who doesn't believe that, I don't think the Islamic Republic is as vulnerable as some of my comrades believe. I think they have the organs of repression in their power. They have a layer around the clergy that will fight to the last man and last woman to defend the Islamic Republic. And therefore, I don't think they are in danger at all. Maybe I might be proven wrong, but I don't think they are. What they are doing is playing the long game, and they are actually thinking beyond November. So Israel is panicking. For Israelis and Saudis, there might be a change of guards in the White House. So they are panicking. They want regime change today in Iran. At the same time, I think Iran is planning that even if Trump is re-elected, have they got the reserve? Can they survive? And that's why Iran has considered this unbelievable deal with China. The Iran-China deal is apparently $400 billion, maybe a lot more. It will allow China access to cheap oil, which is crucial for China, but it will also allow China to invest. The financial transactions about this will be done electronically through these new currencies that China has created, ERMB, and there'll be 5,000 Chinese in Iran. So I'm not sure if Iran will wait for November to see if they can wait as long as that and then do the deal with China if Trump is re-elected, or if they are under so much pressure by the Chinese right now that they will make the deal now. It's clear that for Iran, China was not the first choice. China has been making this offer for the last 4 years. Iran's leaders might give a lot of slogans against the US, but as soon as they have any money, their money is sent abroad, and it's not sent to China, it's sent to Europe or the United States. They are very, if you like, Anglo-Saxon orientated, and after that, the European countries get their money and their wealth. So I don't think that, so we have to see what happens with that. I do think that Trump will push for a deal between the rest of these countries, Oman, Bahrain next, and then finally Saudi Arabia, to normalize relations with Israel, and will present this in November as his major achievement. We haven't been able to do regime change in Iran. We didn't get as far as annexation of the West Bank, but we have achieved this, and we have achieved normalization of these relations with Israel. This will have consequences for the rest of the world, because as you can imagine, then it will be very hard to, it'll be even harder to criticize the state of Israel. But anyway, I will leave it at that. I know I haven't covered many issues. As the admins will change the setup of the room, I'm going to try and show some pictures that show strikes by workers workers protesting about non-payment of wages. One of them with a number, someone is saying 33 months we haven't been paid, and they have TAPE workers. This will go while I think the admins have to change that. So anyway, I'll stop now.
Thank you, Yasmin. The admins are beavering away in the background, presumably setting up. Okay. Could comrades indicate if they want to speak? When this adding process finishes, obviously. Kevin? Kevin, you're asking a question?
Yes, Mark. Pardon me. Thanks, Yasmin, for a very informative contribution, and as ever, I learned a lot. This is really just a very simple question, but it links into your perhaps your concluding couple of sentences about the establishment of the diplomatic relations between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, and links between Israel and other countries. I just wondered if you'd comment on that. I'm thinking particularly of some recent reports about groups in Sudan and Morocco and other parts of the Persian Gulf that put out feelers. I suppose my interest is this: you've made the point that often governments will publicly declare one thing and then privately do another. And I just wondered what, in a sense, is in it for the various governments, that they can carry on all sorts of deals and trade and so on, and even diplomatically they can support, various states covertly. I wonder what the public benefit is, say, for Morocco or for Sudan or for these other states. And then the last point, sort of connected to that as well, another question, and I'm afraid I have to rely upon English language media, so I can't look at local media really, other than some of the Israeli or other locally based papers, but they may have their limitations. But rumors about some sort of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, again, I think possibly rather unlikely, because publicly the Saudis make great play of being the guardians of the holy places and so on. And I understand that realpolitik will always trump piety. But the role of Jared Kushner and his personal relationship with the Crown Prince, again, is it one of these instances where it's probably in everybody's interest for these relationships to remain covert, although very important, and particularly in terms of the wider geopolitics you were discussing, but whether again there might be a state interest in openly coming to some sort of repression with Israel. I'm just interested in the sort of thinking. You know, we know that states often work together. They do this quite secretly, and you've explained that very well. I'm more interested on the occasions when they make public declarations. You know, why they have to do that and what the political advantage is. So thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Daniel Lazar.
Hello, thank you very much for that talk. I just wanted to clarify two issues. One is the role of oil. I mean, the Persian Gulf has been a leading supplier for the global market since the 1920s. And we know that oil creates powerful rent-seeking effects, which have a huge distorting consequences for the economy as a whole. My favorite example is Equatorial Guinea, a country of about 1.3 million people in West Africa, which was a sort of a rundown third world state until 1995, when oil was discovered. And it went from being a rundown third world state to a terrifying dictatorship in which all indices of human development plunged because of this discovery of oil, because of the influx of oil profits into the country. And the Persian Gulf has seen similar consequences, which are felt throughout the region, not for years or decades, but at this point for close to a century. And so this has, to me, has affected every aspect of political development, social development throughout the entire region. We now know that oil prices are plunging. They actually went into negative territory, I believe, in March or April, something that no one even thought was possible. But now the entire Middle Eastern oil economy is facing something like bankruptcy, or at least long-term decline. So I'd like to know what you think the that are for regional politics. And secondly, I'd like you, if you don't mind, to clarify the role of religion. Now, at religion and religious conflict, otherwise known as sectarianism. I'm concerned because, I mean, I think that the religious problem is quite real. It's real in every society, but it's real also in the Gulf region. And the Bolshevik tradition has always involved a vigorous struggle against religion, a vigorous critique of religion, and of religion's consequences for social development. And that assumes that religion is a real force that must be combated, that religious conflict, interreligious conflict, is not simply a convenient excuse or a mask for imperial intervention, but is a real force which must be considered in its own right. So that's it. I'd appreciate some clarification on those two questions.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to take Comrade Chris Barrett, then I'm going to bring Yasmin back in. And yes, John, I've seen your request for speaking. Yep.
Yeah, hello everybody. So can everyone see me? Is that better? Good, good. Better than last time. Look, I think I'd have a go on that thing about talking about religion. Is that there are going to be all kinds of efforts to imply that religion makes any kind of Middle Eastern country or a movement, 1,000 times worse if it's fanatical or whatever, or that in Iran there might be some view that because it's a theocracy that means that this is especially tyrannical compared to other bourgeois regimes. But it's definitely, to me, the wrong approach, because it is all about imperialism, and it is all about the breakdown of the US empire. And it's in that context that ideologically the great masses of the planet are striving to fight imperialism in one way or another. And it's now vast across Africa and the Middle East that people have been using Islamic movements to try to fight back against Western corruption and power of their governments, of their stooge governments. And you get movements like Boko Haram, which means down with Western tutelage across Africa. You've had the Taliban, you've had many other movements that have used, especially ISIS, that have used Islamic ideology. Now, Islamic ideology is balmy in the sense that anything religious is balmy. It's not Marxist, it's not rational. But that doesn't mean opposing, it doesn't mean condemning such movements because they are, or condemning the violence they carry out, or condemning terror, because this is pure Western hypocrisy. The West is exerting a diktat over the Middle East and over Africa, and people are going to fight it in all manner of different ways, including carrying out what the West calls terror attacks, and which even are, in a sense, terror attacks. I mean, certainly, if bits of Manchester get blown up and innocent civilians get killed, that is an act, that is terror. But it is not for anyone Marxist to go around condemning it, because it's the violence of the anger of a vast number of people against imperialism. And all that imperialism will do is take any such hypocritical condemnations, such crocodile tears, and uses them to distract from its economic crisis. And it's a betrayal of workers on a par with betraying workers in World War I to the defense of the fatherland, to be wanting to condemn the violence of oppressed people against imperialism. And there's no words in Lenin against this, which is often also sometimes used by fake lefts to pretend that Lenin was against terrorism, which he wasn't. He was only against terrorism carried out by his own side if it disorganized the ranks of the Bolshevik party. He wasn't ever against the violence of people under imperialism. It's like being against an Islamic movement that was fighting General Gordon in Khartoum, or being against the Zulus in Africa when they're fighting British redcoats. Or it's like being on the side of the American 7th Cavalry when they're massacring Indians, Native Americans, because on the grounds that Native Americans aren't Marxists. It's just the opposite. Yeah, human sympathies should all be for the oppressed people, fighting in whatever organizations are available. And of course, it's also a function of the giving up of the world communist movement from being capable fighters against imperialism in favor of being pacifists and collaborators with bourgeois stooge governments across the Middle East. So on what Yassamine said, to me, it was a certain amount of good information, but it's not Marxism, because it didn't start in its analysis from the global crisis. And it's in that global crisis where, as I've tried to describe, vast numbers of people are being drawn into struggle against imperialism as the US empire breaks down, that it's possible to see why Trump does what he does. It's because American imperialism has turned towards what could be called historically isolationism. It's moved from wanting to be seen as the world's policeman to where it uses its power and finance to prop up stooge dictatorships for its benefit, but also for the benefit of all imperialism, including French, German, Japanese imperialism, and finances, the Cold War efforts to hem in the Soviet Union and China, etc. It now has to shift openly, because of crisis hitting the global capitalist system, to going for America first, which is a classic fascist slogan within America, and the doing down of Europe, which is why Europe is now described by Trump as a foe, meaning economically, which also explains why sanctions against Iran are then become effective US empire weapons against European commerce and trading and banking finance. And it's in that context, it's far more understandable. And one final point, it's so crucial that defeat for imperialism is the watchword because of color revolutions, because of the CIA, American imperialist and Saudi efforts to find a favorable way to get the regime change they want in Iran. It's absolutely crucial in this world balance of class forces to want if there's going to be an overthrow in Iran, what you want is for the leadership doing that overthrow to be clear, for them to be anti-imperialist, not pro-imperialist. It's going to be decisive, and I think that it's in the context of wider Arab revolt, Arab street revolt against imperialism. For example, in Egypt,
could you wind up
Lebanon,
now, Chris?
I will. That there can be great optimism about the Arab proletariat finally getting to grips with all these tyrannical Arab kingdoms, and of course, in the end, in Palestine, driving all the Zionists into the sea. Thanks.
Shall I come back?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you could come back, yes, thank you.
Sorry. So first on the UAE-Israeli deal and how this would benefit countries like Morocco. I think the way this works is that these countries have problems. For example, Morocco is actually post-corona is facing a lot of opposition, protests, and so on. For these countries, the US can dictate to them, you're doing this. This is the way to, if you like, become more, we'll take care of you. You will be part of our allies. And right now, the US doesn't have what it used to have, which was the European Union, leaders of, even Boris Johnson occasionally disagrees with what Trump is doing. So the US administration has widened its list of allies beyond what you would call powerful traditional allies of the United States. For Morocco, there will be those advantages. If it happens, it will be, if you like, Trump is presenting this as the alliance of like a US allied group. It will include some Arabs and Israel. Now, the one thing to remember is that there has been, contrary to what the press keeps forgetting, there has been other open deals between Arab countries and Israel. It just hasn't gone anywhere. Jordan 1994, Egypt 1979. They just mean nothing. In some ways, you could say it's there on paper. I mean, the worst bit is the deals, the relationships they all have with Israel in secret. So we've got people like United Arab Emirates, long before this deal, a Hamas leader, I don't support Hamas, but I also don't support assassinations. A Hamas leader was assassinated. Moshe sent me this information this week in United Arab Emirates. The Mossad head was there, an Israeli politician advisor close to Netanyahu was there, and the politician didn't know. Mossad did this, UAE clearly knew this, because otherwise how could it have happened? And the same could be said of all these Arab countries. One other issue that maybe will affect countries like Morocco is that they're also being told that there will be tourism from Israel. And that will improve their financial situation. So that's another carrot, if you like. But also, you can't expect much from, an ineffective king such as the King of Morocco, or Sudan that has had has had civil war, is in many ways a left state and a failed state and so on. I think you should remember that there are countries that are opposing all of this, and amongst them, one should name Kuwait, Jordan. Kuwait and Jordan opposed both the annexation publicly. They actually, I think the Kuwaiti ambassadors threw the annexation document in front of the Israeli delegation into the rubbish bin when he'd been invited to talk about annexation. The problem is that after the civil wars, after so many divided loyalties in these countries, the way the Arab Street, as it was called, would mobilize for Palestine if something stupid as the UAE deal happened, that is weaker. And this is the fault of both the Palestinian groups that haven't lived up to the expectations of the ordinary people, numerous sellouts, the fact that they don't present themselves very well, the victory of Israeli and Saudi propaganda, and so on. So there are lots of factors to take into account. On oil, I think, yes, I mean, I could have said, and I probably should have said, that Iran's economy and those of the Gulf are mainly what is called rentier economies. They survive despite all the efforts of the last 40 years for Iran to diversify its economy. Its main export remained oil, and it's very vulnerable when prices become negative or when sanctions don't allow tankers to pick up Iranian oil. It's not, you've sold it to Venezuela, you've sold it to India, but you can't actually get a tanker who can get insurance to come and pick up that oil. So you really do become bankrupt. But I think the policy is in a way, and I think since the Iraq War, one has to say this, is more the reverse for the United States. The main issue is stopping China's access to cheap oil, as opposed to maintaining cheap oil for itself. It probably that isn't the primary concern. And in a country like Iran, the influence of oil was much more limited, I would say, than it was in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was a desert without oil. Iran had a history, had culture, had an economy, had agriculture before oil. So I think in Iran, yes, oil is very important, but as the last 2-3 years have shown, the country had other things. It had a car manufacturing plant. It had 3 major car manufacturers. It was selling cars to the region. It is a country where awareness of IT is very high, that both the use and the awareness of IT is very high. So you can't, I think you shouldn't say that effect of oil in Iran is the same as it was in Kuwait, for example. As a child, I visited Kuwait, there was nothing there. Now you go, I'm sure I wouldn't recognize, I haven't been back, but I'm sure I wouldn't recognize the skyscrapers, advanced technologies, bringing ski slopes to Qatar and so on. So yes, I agree that oil has dramatically changed these countries, but the level it has changed depends on what was there before as well. In terms of religion, I think there is this concept in the West that religion was never challenged in the Middle East, that there was never any movement against religion. Well, the early part of the 20th century and part of middle of 20th century, we saw major secular movements. In the early part of 20th century, I would name Baasism, nationalism, Ataturkism, all as that. Okay, some of these were from above, and maybe that's why they created a reaction from below in terms of revival of religion. But in the case of Iran in particular, the revival of religion was deliberate. The Shah never pretended he was not a Shia. He always appeared, he said, the Shia God, Allah, has put me in power. And in fact, in order to attack the left, the Shah's main, if you like, allies for many years, since 1953, were the clergy, although some of them later became opposed to the Shah. But for example, no gathering, no mosque gathering, no political gathering of religious groups was banned under the Shah, while the left would get arrested for distributing a leaflet in a campus in a university, and very often would end up being tortured to find out who they were connected with. Yes, the religious leadership, the Khomeini leadership, and that side of the religious movement were very conservative in the tactics they used, and therefore were less repressed. But that does not change the fact that tolerance of that religious opposition allowed them, when the protests arrived, they suddenly became opponents of the regime. Or some of them who were in exile, as opposed to have been killed, like the left was killed, returned. So there's historic reason why in Iran that was the case. And of course, there is now amongst the youth a considerable nostalgia for the secularism of the Shah's era. And all you tell them is, well, that was the surface. If you took that, if you moved that veneer a little bit aside, you would see that there was a lot of sections of the population, mainly poorer sections, who played at being secular but weren't. I just want to make one comment about Jara, or question on ecology. So, yes, the Islamic Republic pays a lot of lip service to environment. There is a minister for environment. Like anybody else, there's programs, and every company says, oh, we are doing everything we can for sustainability and environment. I must admit I'm as cynical about those claims as I am about Western companies making such claims. Most of these people have now learned the language of making such claims. In Iran, there were ecologists who were activists who were arrested, and some of them were forced into exile. So that has dampened what I would call the growth amongst the younger generation of an environmentalist movement. I'll stop here, otherwise I'll go below time.
Thank you, Yasmin. Jack?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and thanks, Yasmin. I think that the 53 coup is just worthwhile a bit of a mention, because the BBC is running, I think, some sort of program documentary on it, basically with the MI6 claiming credit. It wasn't just the CIA, it was MI6. But the point I was going to make is that while the CIA can still carry out coups, it does say something, doesn't it? That there you are since 1979, here's an opponent, and it hasn't managed to dislodge it. And clearly that isn't because of the profound strength of the regime. It is worthwhile you maybe just having a few remarks on that sort of symbiotic relationship between American threats and the stability of the regime. Anyway, that's just an aside. In terms of oil, well, you know, all I was going to say is that those that were predicting, you know, the exhaustion of oil ought to think again. And if anyone's going to be ruined, I would have thought, in terms of whatever the price happens to be at the moment, it's US shale production. As I understand it, I don't know what the figures are today, but over last year, the United States emerged as the world's largest producer. Clearly, though, not because of the profitability of its oil wells, but precisely because the prices were high. Just a few other points. I think the Bolsheviks, in the broadest sense of the term, had a very confused, if you take them as a whole, view on religion. So you did have, Dan, the League of the Militant Godless, and you did have instances under Soviet power of the peasants being marched out to the churchyard. There you are, you disinter the coffin of a saint, you open it up, and my God, he's rotted and he can't be a saint. And this is meant to teach the poor peasants, you know, about enlightenment, and they're meant to go, oh my God, you know, saints don't rot, therefore the religion is a load of rubbish. But it's worthwhile pointing out that Lenin actually contributed to a paper. It was a left-wing paper, but it was a paper that was specifically targeted at the old believers who weren't a tiny sect. The Bolsheviks wanted to win those people to themselves, and therefore they, when they came to power, they excused the military service. They granted them land so they could establish their utopian experiments. Also, I think it's worth emphasizing, again, I'd be interested in terms of what Yasmin and Anne say on this, because they know more about it than I do. When it came to Islam, they certainly showed a lot of tolerance. They recognized that Islam was the religion of the oppressed. And so, yeah, under Stalin, yes, in 1927, 1928, you had this unveiling because religion was the enemy, and that had disastrous consequences. So all I was going to say is, yes, of course, the Bolsheviks were atheist, but what they advocated at a state level was secularism, which is the equality between all religions, but also the equality between non-religion and religion. So you have the freedom to make religious propaganda, but also the freedom to make anti-religious propaganda. You don't have a war on religion, or you shouldn't have a war on religion. And I do think things like the League of the Militant Godless and the Hajam, if I'm pronouncing it right, Hujam, that is a violation, in my view, of the program. Just a couple of other points. I don't know. I know, obviously, Yasmin, you've got relatives in Iran. I know someone who went to Iran not that long ago. And what she was struck by, this is mixing, I readily admit, with people from North Tehran who, you know, are better off. What struck her was none of them were religious, and all of them after the work had finished, went out boozing. Completely counter to the stereotypical view of what an Iranian is. None of them had any time for the regime. None of them had any time for the religion, and they all liked alcohol, maybe to excess. Having said all that, I do think it's just worthwhile pointing out Lenin's writings, Chris, against pan-Islamicism. Lenin didn't just say tolerance. He did recognize, I don't know what you want to call it, but reactionary anti-imperialism. Either way, it wasn't simply a question of looking at those fighting imperialism and then putting a plus sign to them. He did recognize pan-Islamicism as being an enemy. And yet again, I mean, I think we also should be very careful about saying who is at the moment an enemy or an opponent of the United States is anti-imperialist, because that could lead you to the position before World War II of saying that Japan was an anti-imperialist power, or in the 19th century, the United States was an anti-imperialist power, or German imperialism of the Hitler sort was an anti-imperialist power. So I'm just saying that in the context of Tehran, is the regime of the theocracy anti-imperialist? It's certainly anti-American, or at least in terms of America's made it an enemy, but it would do a deal with the United States tomorrow if it was allowed. And that's the problem that I think we need to distinguish between what some on the left call anti-imperialism, which is merely a sort of conjunctural thing, and genuine anti-imperialism. I think the two do need to be distinguished.
Okay, Jim Cook.
Thank you. Thank you, Yassamine. It was so many of those events, of course, are well known from the news, but to have background and detail and linking like that was very useful. You said about the Make America Great Again. I thought in 2016 that Clinton wanted to have a war with Russia and Trump wanted to have a war with Iran. But it's not just Iran, obviously. Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, they're all enemies of freedom and democracy. And it's like the Monroe Doctrine now applies to the whole world and not just to the Americas. And we saw that in the Project for the 21st Century as well in '98. The Bush crowd, as they became, and a senior moment, I can't remember the names now, I believe there was a Donald in there. Now that the Soviet Union had gone, it was time for the United States to tidy up the world. And Iraq was posed then as one of the first places to go and sort out. On religion, one of the most moving pieces of literature ever, I think, is Marx on the heart of the heartless world, Messiah of the oppressed creature, and so on, that paragraph. And of course, we see it all over the world. We have, as we keep saying, the enormous weakness of the left. So where are people to turn? And we've got massive religious movements in the United States and Brazil, and perhaps nearly every country in the world. It struck me when you spoke about the shanty towns next to the gold steps. It reminded me of India when I was there about 15, 16 years ago. Exactly the same thing. Yeah, you'd get walled mansions with armed guards sitting on plastic chairs at the gate, and tents on the sides of the road with scaffolding and tarpaulins where people were cooking their meals. Another question really. Madeleine Albright said that 500,000 child deaths in Iraq was a price worth paying. We don't hear as much about child deaths and so on in Iran. I'm just wondering what the situation there is. I suppose nowadays it's dwarfed by what's going on in the Yemen. But of course, that's the thing in these sanctions are not just political moves, they're ways of killing people, aren't they?
Have you finished, Jim? Yes. Sorry. Okay. Mike McNair.
I had a couple of small things in relation to Yassamine's point. I've made the point before, I think, but it's probably worth repeating it, that one of the decisive moments is the 1983 Beirut truck bomb, blowing up 200 US Marines and driving the United States out of Lebanon. And that's burnt into, along with the embassy siege and the defeat of the attempts to rescue the diplomats, is burnt into the memory of the US military and securocratic apparatus, and returns over and over and over again as the definition of terrorism, and why the Iranian Islamic Republic is characterized as promoting terrorism everywhere. Promoting terrorism everywhere means merely that the Iranian Islamic Republic backs Hezbollah, and that Hezbollah has inflicted defeats both on the United States and on Israel. And it's that there is this aspect, which I guess is also there in the utterly irrational attack on Iraq from the point of view of objective interests of world capitalism, the attack on Iraq or of the US management of the Middle East or anything like that. It was about Saddam Hussein has dissed the United States and hasn't been got rid of. We've failed to execute regime change. Of course, the man was put in by a regime change operation in the first place, but that now we have to do something about it. The other, I guess, is in relation to corruption. When you say foundation, I assume that it's the same thing as the stuff which is called in Sharia law waqf, which purports to be a charity, but it only has to be a charity after the family of the founder dies out. So it's like a charity in English law, but it only has to be a charity after the family of the founder dies out, with the consequence that you find in pre-colonial, well, in Ottoman Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, in the Egyptian Mamluk regime, in Mughal India, you had a periodic seizure of waqf property, because the law in relation to waqf, because it allowed the mixing of charitable purposes with the private family purposes, made it too easy to immunize private fortunes from taxation, with the result that periodic just seizure is necessary. The car firms becoming banks, compare again England and the early 1700s, the hollow sword blade company, which was set up to establish a patent to manufacture hollow sword blades, which would be cheaper than solid ones, turned itself very rapidly into a bank associated with the Tory party, and then was part of the financial operations which involved in the South Sea bubble in the 17 teens. So that this phenomenon of corruption and cronyism. This is just normal. It is normal. Corruption and cronyism is normal to capitalism. What's interesting is that your point, from that point of view, is your point about 90%, the degree of privatization. That's privatizing the Revolutionary Guard. Yeah, there are guys who argue for full privatization of the police as the solution to the Black Lives Matter problem. Would be if these guys were private police, they would be better. I don't know why the hell they imagine that. That level of extremism. And to Dan's point about oil rents, I think it's important to recollect that the British state was a wool rent state, and the United States before 1861-65 was a cotton rent and tobacco rent state. British in the Middle Ages was a wool rent state. The difference essentially is, do you actually have the power to impose effective import substitution tariff regime, which is what the United States acquired by defeating the South in 1861, by the defeat of the South in 1861-65, and it's what the British state acquired by the successive wars with Spain and with the Netherlands in the 16th and 17th centuries, acquired the capacity, and then the fact that you've got a large amount of income coming from primary product export doesn't stop you from. So that here I'm, for one moment, agreeing with Chris Barrett. You have to start with this stuff about, this is about imperial management and the other side of the coin in relation to the exploitation of conflicts within Islam / the exploitation of conflicts between Islam and Hinduism. We've got Hindutva movement in India. We've got the Indian invasion of Kashmir, which is quite, not invasion of, but the Indian suspension of the status of Kashmir, which appears to be a purely sectarian operation, but is in fact a geopolitical operation against the ability of China to engage in operations in Central Asia by and against Pakistan, the Pakistani-Chinese alliance, and the Buddhist versus Muslims in Myanmar, Burma, Buddhist versus Muslims in Sri Lanka. These are operations of the colonial regime carried over into the post-colonial regime. But the problem with Chris's point is essentially what he's proposing is support for plucky little Serbia. Plucky little Serbia, in this case, in 1914, being terrorist operations run out of the Serbian Secret Service against the Austro-Hungarian, British and French governments, for which the Serbs were a proxy. And
Mike, could you wind up fairly soon?
Yeah, in this stuff, the Islamists are operating as a proxy for Saudi Arabia in its local interest, which in turn is a proxy for the United States and the United States' geopolitical interests in exercising negative control over the oil taps in the Middle East against China, against France, Germany, etc., etc., etc. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to bring Yasmin back in, and then I have Pam Blakelock, Anne McShane, and Moshe.
Right. Okay. First on US threats and stability, what Jack was talking about. To be honest, I think the US has helped the survival of the Islamic Republic inadvertently, but they have played an important role in making sure the government doesn't go. First, in their choice of regime change. I mean, their choice in Iraq was pretty stupid, I know, but the choice in Iran makes the whole idea of having Chalabi as a replacement for Saddam look like an intelligent choice. So you've got first a religious sect that makes the Munis look like very rational, reasonable people, the Mujahideen Khalq, who do mass weddings, who tell women to divorce their husbands because the leader has decided they should, who force children out of camps when they're born. I couldn't give you the full list, but so they've chosen that. And apart from everything else, they're a religious group. They are still calling themselves Islamic Democratic Group. Of course, for Saudi Arabia, they're an ideal regime change alternative because Saudis then tell their own people, look, we've got a better Islamic group to come to power in our neighbor Iran. The fact that the majority of the Iranian population have disdain for these people, it's very clear. And then we've got the royalists. I mean, you can complain about corruption, you can complain about money leaving the country from the sons of Ayatollahs, but the son of the ex-Shah is living through the $40 billion that he's left Iran with. And therefore, it's a bit difficult to actually raise a campaign against corruption and money leaving the country when that's your alternative. And these people intellectually are also of Trump's level. So the slogans they come up with, I don't know who advises them, but they really are not very good. So I think the choice of the United States has made the regime stable, but also the threat, because the threat is no longer that we will, and people have looked at Syria, looked at Iraq, they know what happens. They don't think this government will go, there'll be a steady coup, the CIA will bring back the Shah's son, and everything will go back to normal. They know that this is the era of imperialist destruction. There is no developing of semi-developed countries to become better clients, better exploited countries. This is the time of destruction. So there's no reason for anyone to take that into account. In terms of tolerance, I think Jack is right. I think if you read what was written in 1920, 21, there is a very confused, and in a way the Iranian left was also confused because they were reading 1917 to 1924, because we didn't read anything after 24. But there are confused messages, even in terms of, do you support nationalist groups or don't you? There is a book, 100-Year History of Middle Eastern Communist Parties. I did the chapter on Iran, but I had to do quite a lot of work to find documents about the era where, in some ways, there were competing forces, a softer nationalist movement, which was important for the survival of the first socialist state, had it come to power in Iran or had it gained allies in Iran, and then a more radical, more communist, less religious, less nationalist group. And the Comintern's attitude is confused, and at the end, the interests of the survival of the first socialist state dominates, in my opinion. I could be wrong, but I think, and I understand it. I mean, some of the left go on and on about this, but you have to also then think there was civil war of the whites and so on. Your point about no one being any more religious, I think it's true of working class areas. I think in rural areas, religion is very much still adhered to by sections of the community. But remember that there's been major urbanization in Iran over the last 40 years. The Islamic Republic has done this. cities have become huge. So quite a lot of what I used to go to a village for because I had relatives there near Urumi. It's now part of the town. It's one of the suburbs. It used to be 35 kilometers outside the town, but the town has grown and covered that village. So the if you like, the rural areas are getting smaller and smaller, but amongst them there is region. On consumption of alcohol is really dangerous. I mean, AA has one of its largest Middle Eastern branches in Iran because of addiction to alcohol. But also, if you meet people who have come out of Iran, not just my relatives who are obviously from North Tehran and used to drink, they have drank all their life. But you meet working class trade unionist activists, and you are shocked at how much they can drink. I remember a Scottish lady, a comrade, who met some of these, and she was shocked, as a Glaswegian, she was shocked at the level of alcohol consumption by people from working class backgrounds who'd come out of Iran. So I can't add to this. I think didn't say a lot about COVID, partly because I think Mohsen Shahmanish tomorrow will say a lot more about it. But remember that Iran was the first country after China that was targeted by the West as one of the sources of COVID. And this is partly because there were lots of travel between Wuhan province. Apparently some young seminary students in Rome were coming back from Wuhan. They are Muslim Chinese, but there was also trade deals and so on. So Iran had a very high peak. And at that time, all the publicity was, oh, look, Iran has so many thousands, so many hundred of COVID patients. Right, I think because of the number of doctors they have trained, they manage, and they have done that, they have managed to contain it. But that doesn't mean that the numbers that the state puts out can be believed. I would say, I think everyone would say it's about a third of the real figures. Having said that, it could have been worse, is what we can say. And the sanctions have affected it. So COVID with sanctions, there was a call in the UN to remove sanctions on not just Iran, any countries that had sanctions. And the US vetoed it quite clearly, said, no, that's not the time to remove sanctions. So COVID plus sanction is really a disaster. Just to give you an idea, sanctions include, for example, a lot of surgical devices that can have dual purpose use. So they can be used in cutting and therefore can be used in the nuclear industry. It's very vague, their connection to nuclear industry, but even those devices are on Iran's, on the US sanction list. So yeah, I think Madeleine Albright's 500,000, we are talking of 40 years of sanctions, some of which has been severe, as in the last 3 years, some of which have been pretty bad, as in the Ahmadinejad years. So yeah, I think we're much higher. I should have mentioned 1983 Beirut bomb. It's not that I forgot. I was trying not to add to the problem, but of course for Bolton, that is the issue. Foundations are different from Waqf, and I will explain a bit about Waqf as well. So the main foundation is a Farsi word, it's not Arabic. So in Iran, there's this duality of Persian and Arabic. Words that have a Persian name usually have a different history. So during the Shah's time, we had something called Bunyad Pahlavi Foundation. It did things like Prince Charles's education thing, but it also did rural development, that kind of work. And it was quite a rich foundation. That foundation became the foundation for the dispossessed immediately after the revolution. And that is the foundation led by Ayatollah Khamenei and his son. And it has got involved now. It's gone beyond, if you like, small projects. It's now involved in major projects. So you could have a cement factory that is bought by this foundation, right? WAF still exists, and WAF is actually become very newsworthy. So the clergy, I don't know how they've managed this, about a few weeks ago, managed to create a WAF for the mountain of Damavand. Mountain of Damavand is a very high mountain north of Tehran. It dominates Tehran, that whole chain of mountains, and from Tehran you can see. And a family of clerics had wafted Mount Damavand. It really is unbelievable. There was such a protest. There was people making jokes about it. There was serious opposition. And they were forced to, the government was forced to backtrack. And there is no more. They've stopped the WAF. But WAF exists, and yes, clerics are making a lot of money from WAF. I have to say quite a bit about, well, I won't say too much, but I have to say I agree entirely with Michael on Capitalism. There is a book written by a number of academics. Every chapter covers a country, called Capitalism in the Middle East, published 2019. The section on Iran is actually not bad, because the person who wrote it has done some work, called Kayvan Harris of UCLA. But the problem, as the book was presented at my college, I actually made the point. The point about the book is the whole title implies crony capitalism is a creation of Middle East. I remember privatization in the UK, and I remember the Thatcher era where privatization started. We know very well how people around the Conservative Party were benefiting from this. It's inevitable that in a dictatorship, it's a smaller category of people around the circles of power that benefit from privatization, and cronyism is part of it. But to believe that this has anything special about Iran is completely wrong. It's, or the Middle East for that matter. This is just capitalism. That's it.
Thank you, Yasmin. We have quite a few people who've indicated to speak, and we are getting towards the end of the session, so I would remind comrades to be as pithy as they can without ruining their argument. Okay, Pam Blakelock, please.
Right, thank you. In relation to oil, we were told, I think, that the United States had become self-sufficient because, or mainly because of the shale oil. And therefore, people said, well, if the US is now self-sufficient, why do they need to control the Middle East? But it's not just for the oil. As far as I understand, first of all, going back to the beginning, pre-First World War, Britain wanted to control the Middle East. They wanted to have the Suez Canal. They wanted to have access to India, etc. And then, since the United States has become the world hegemon of imperialism, that has continued. And the need for the United States to control the Middle East is also a logistical part of the need for world domination. And then to lead from that into the use of Israel as the United States Airbus or military base, or what you want to call it, it was a crucial aspect of United States policy, I think post 1967 in particular. So what seems to be happening now is that these Trump agreements are the United States way of controlling the Middle East. And, you know, the deal of the century is an extension of this control. And Moshe answered my question about United States bases. do they actually need military bases in Israel to control the Middle East? Well, and are there any, or is it just sufficient to have Israel as their client state? And Moshe pointed out that yes, there are military bases in United States military bases in Israel, but not very large. And then on the question of religion, and I think Yasmin touched on this in relation to the Soviet Union, that in Iraq had, I think, the biggest communist party in the Middle East. How did that happen? If religion was so all-encompassing there, how come the Communist Party, atheist Communist Party, became so popular? And since then, and for example, in Britain, although the official Christian church has declined, we have seen a growth of other Black churches, Muslim churches. The role of religion, appears to have become quite strong, although I believe now in the younger generation, it is also declining. And as Yasmin points out, the younger generation in Iran, it's also declining. So that was my last point. Yeah, so Mike's contribution, I thought, brought together in ways I hadn't thought of these different connections of the proxy wars taking place. Yeah, and so on this question of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, in relation to fight, those who are opposed to the United States but not opposed to imperialism, I think the Bolshevik tendency falls into that trap, because I believe they said that if there was a war between the United States and ISIS, they would support ISIS because ISIS was opposed to the United States. But of course, ISIS is completely not anti-imperialist at all. So, these traps are there for us. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Moshe?
Oh, just several disparate points. First of all, going back to what Yasmin said at the very beginning of her talk, I think Trump is absolutely genuine in trying to avoid military adventures. I mean, his whole approach to diplomacy, if you can call it that, is that of a crude businessman. Apply economic pressure. I mean, he prefers, of course, behind economic pressure, there must be always mafia style, the threat of violence. And for this, Israel especially is useful, which is its role, part of its role as a junior partner of the United States is being the local policeman. This is Israel's traditional role, but as I will come back to it later, it goes far beyond this nowadays. I mean, Israel's role in the service of imperialism is become more global. I don't know which film the BBC is showing about the anti-Mossad coup. I have watched a film, very thoroughly researched film by Targi Amirani called Coup 53. And it's based on new documentation, new research, absolutely solid. And it does transpire that the role of MI6 in the coup was much more important than that of the CIA. The CIA went along. Of course, it gave its blessing and so on. But the main sort of the conductor of this orchestra was MI6, and especially Norman Derbyshire, as someone actually remarked in the chat in this Zoom meeting. If you go to the very beginning, there's a mention of a document, a report by Norman Derbyshire, which was kept more or less semi-secret, but is now being outed. And it is clear that the role of the MI6 was very, very central. The initiative was actually MI6, of course, with the help of the CIA. As for Israel's relations with various Arab countries, first of all, Morocco. The relations between Israel and Morocco have been very friendly for a very long time. They are not at the level of diplomatic, formal diplomatic relations, but there's a lot of Israeli tourism in Morocco. The relationship has been extremely smooth and friendly for yonks. As for the Emirates and other states of the Gulf, take Saudi Arabia first of all. There are undeclared but hardly secret relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I mean, there are mutual visits. There is coordination, and there is certainly what is in effect an alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia, directed against Iran, but also on other grounds. As for the Israeli presence in the Gulf, in the Emirates and other Gulf states, there is a lot of Israeli exports, direct and indirect, to these states, mostly high-tech. The high-tech, for the most part, is in the security sector. I mean, high-tech for repression and for surveillance, but also desalination of seawater, which is very important in those Gulf states where there's very little fresh water. And Israel actually sells them technology of water, desalination of seawater, in which Israel is quite advanced for its own needs and its own reasons. So that's all I had to say.
Thank you, Marcia. Anne McShane.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, just a few points. Firstly, I think it's clear that there is a caricature of the Islamic world used by imperialism in order to repress those countries. I mean, you can see, obviously, most recently, in terms of Afghanistan, the attitude of Hillary Clinton and other US Democrats towards Afghan women, presenting themselves as their saviors in respect of their repressed lives. And obviously all of this really being a cynical ploy in order to provide a cover for the invasion and the continued occupation of Afghanistan, and meaning nothing for the women themselves except increased repression and even more dangerous living circumstances. So just want to relate that to the Bolsheviks and religion at the beginning in relation to the East. People will be aware of the fact, I believe it was at the Baku conference, that Zinoviev and the Bolsheviks made a call for a holy colonialism, i.e. utilizing the language that would normally be associated with religious calls. And I think that that's interesting. Perhaps that shows obviously that they were trying to connect with the kind of cultural and religious meanings within those societies. And certainly, from my knowledge of Central Asia, the Bolsheviks from, I would say, 1921 to 1926 conducted a program of colonization, wherein which they tried to win over the red mullahs from the traditionalists, and the red mullahs being the representatives of the Jadi movement, which was a progressive national movement, which they were in government after national delimitation in Uzbekistan and all of the other countries that were set up under that. So they were allies of the Bolsheviks. Then comes Stalin into the ascendancy on the Central Committee. And with that, I think it was late 1925, early 1926, the formation of the League of the Militant Godless, and with Yaroslavsky as one of the key characters leading that. And to me, from my research, what that meant was repression. The campaign to emancipate so-called women of Central Asia and Azerbaijan under the hujum, meaning assault, was simply an attack on that society in order to soften it up for the 1928 first five-year plan. It had nothing to do with progressive ideas. It had everything to do with repression. And indeed, all of the work that had previously been carried out by the women's section of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union among Islamic women who had been wearing the veil, and I won't go into the details of all of that, that was all destroyed by this hujum. So I really am against militant atheism, because I think that it tries to replace one religion with another, and that ultimately is extremely repressive. And I stand with Nadia Krupskaya, who made a speech at 1928 Conference of Women of the East in opposition to Stalin, basically saying that you cannot reduce everybody to a dead level. You cannot simply ban religious ceremonies or replace them with socialist religious ceremonies, because religion is a very complex phenomenon, and it expresses more often than not the manner in which people live, with all its contradictions, including young people in Iran drinking and then also performing religious ceremonies or taking part in Ramadan. You can see these things everywhere. I think it would be useful, just finally, to say that
And
it would be useful,
wind up
for us to have some sessions and some study on the reality of religion in the Islamic world and in the Middle East. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Daniel Lazar, and then I've got Chris back again. Both will have to be very, very disciplined, as Yasmin needs to reply to the debate.
Okay,
Daniel.
Just a very quick point about the U.S. invasion of Iraq. I think Yasmin called it stupid. It was obviously a highly irrational act that actually wound up playing into Iran's hands and actually in some ways harming U.S. interests in the Gulf region. But it's very important to sort of understand why it happened. The fact that 15 of the 19 hijackers in 9/11 were Saudi nationals led to a grave crisis, because it threatened to destroy this U.S.-Saudi alliance, which dated from 1944. So the first task of the Bush administration was to safeguard this alliance, and the only way it could do it was by somehow accusing Saddam Hussein of responsibility for 9/11. And there's even evidence that the makers of this myth actually believed it, because much of the waterboarding that took place in Afghanistan, et cetera, by the CIA was an attempt to elicit information from accused Al-Qaeda members about the Al-Qaeda Saddam Hussein connection, which the CIA and much of the Bush administration was convinced was a fact. So so in that sense, it was of course irrational, but there was a certain rational undercurrent in the sense that their top priority was protecting the U.S.-Saudi alliance, and therefore covering up the Saudi role in 9/11 and transferring responsibility to Iraq. Crazy as that may seem, that's my only point.
Thank you, Daniel. Chris, you're going to have to be very quick because I want to give Yasmin up to 15 minutes to draw things together. So be pithy, comrade.
Yes, thanks. Hello, everybody again. I should have said I'm speaking on behalf of EPSR, Economic and Philosophical Science Review. The war on Iraq was for the war. The purpose of the war was the war. It was the warmongering. That was the greatest motivation for it, is the US empire and the whole of the world monopoly capitalist economy has been in crisis, worsening crisis, and its turn to warmongering was what drove it to wage war on Iraq. And there's some people who say it was a war for oil. That was prevalent across the left, but this is not the case. It was a war. The purpose of the war was to start the ball rolling, going towards inter-imperialist conflict in World War III, and damaging and smashing up the Middle East. And I can well believe that waterboarding was done in order to get propaganda to use against Saddam, waterboarding of detainees in POWs in Afghanistan. I can well believe that. But this is for Nazi propaganda purposes. The war was for the war. And it's for this reason, it's even more crucial to not fall into condemning terror, because the war on terror has been used as a justification for mass murder across huge parts of this planet. And it is crucial for people to get their heads around that every time they condemn terror, they're just falling into the trap set by the CIA and international propaganda that says anyone opposing American imperialism is a terrorist. And this is the same across America now. It's even more pertinent as Black Lives Matter protesters and Antifa and other people get called terrorists. It's the left needs to drop its rotten, dirty betrayal, which says that there's something true about condemning terror. It's just dirty and rotten. And it's the same as telling Red Indians that they are criminals because they killed settlers across America and massacred them. No, it's the other way around. It's the other way around. They had every right to fight, whatever their ideology, whether they believed in spirit gods or anything else. They had a right in their own country to fight against the 7th Cavalry. And anyone who says
okay, Chris,
that people in Iraq don't have a right to fight,
wind up now, please.
A swine. Yep, there you go.
Thank you, Chris. Cheers.
Very difficult to follow.
Okay, Yasmin.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm going to reply to address, not reply, to a text in the chat. It's rightly pointed out that consuming alcohol is not the same as being anti-religion, and the same youth in Iran who do drinks then go and maybe go to Friday prayers, say their prayers and so on. That's been the case in all Islamic countries. Iran isn't different. I remember during my childhood that was the case as well, except for sections of societies that didn't have any religion at all. I was amongst those sections. But there is a difference from people doing that and then giving their lives to maintain the supreme power, leader in power. And that's what I meant. I meant the kind of religious fervor that brought the Islamic Republic to power. So I can't imagine the youth who are happy to drink, who are happy to socialize, who do criticize the repressive measures in terms of the diktat of the religious state in their private lives, putting their lives at risk to maintain Ayatollah Khamenei in power. And that does make a big difference. And I don't think they remain the kind of extremist ideologies or religious adherence to a religious ideology that Dan Lazar was talking about the kind of people we should be worried about, we should be educating, we should be addressing. This is the 21st century. Most of these people are aware of what's going on in the world. They are complex individuals. They have different attitudes. But at the same time, I think the high level of consumption of alcohol, the way people dress, the way women address the issue of hijab by pulling it, almost limiting it to a headband covering, a see-through headband covering parts of their ponytail, shows that the way the situation has changed. Just before the Islamic Revolution, or at the time when Erdogan was getting popular in Turkey, you would see girls who had never worn a headscarf volunteering to wear severe hijab, and against the calls of their parents, against their own background, because religion was becoming such a mobilizing force. Religion is not, in my opinion, has lost its ability to become a mobilizing force in Iran. And it is true that sections of the middle classes, I will just make a distinction between middle classes and upper classes. There's a section of the middle classes in Iran who will be happy for any change. And yes, partly it is the publicity, the 24/7 publicity of Saudi International TV. They call it Iran International. I call it Saudi International. Some other crappy TV stations and so on. They would be happy. There is amongst this section of the society, some of whom I must stress were supporters of the reformists in Iran, supporters of the Mousavi candidacy, for example. For these people, there is a proletarization. So they were middle class, they were teachers, they were a relatively good life, and they're increasingly impoverished. That impoverishment has made them harsher opponents of the Islamic Republic, and at least in their writings, in their tweets, in their social media presence, you can see there is nostalgia for the Pahlavi era. I don't think they are pro-Mujahid, but there is nostalgia for the Pahlavi era. This is also because the way maybe only the better parts of that era are publicized in various outlets. But again, I think there is a difference there. First of all, this population is not going to go to the streets and put their lives at risk, because that's what it means. Opposing a dictatorship is not having a small gathering in Hyde Park. It's a different thing. They're not going to put their lives at risk. But also, I would say the upper classes have now gone through a very dramatic change. And maybe unfortunately, most of my family are upper classes. I don't even know the middle classes. But from what I can gather from everything my relatives tell me, they went through a period where they might have wanted anyone but the Islamic Republic. But now they are looking at Syria, they are looking at Iraq and saying, well, we hate the Islamic Republic, but this is better than the alternative. Maybe my relatives that are not few, I come from a very large family, and all of them, since I have been on the media, are in touch with me. Some of them I don't even know or remember, but I'm in touch with a very large community. And they all seem to be expressing a very clear opinion that as much as they dislike the Islamic Republic, they rather have this than Syria or Iraq, because they see the destructive nature of interventions. They see how interventions are no longer to safeguard their wealth. They actually managed, these classes actually managed to maintain their wealth in the transition between the Pahlavi era and the Islamic Republic, because they never were the officials of the Pahlavi regime. They had their wealth in land, they had their wealth in maybe even factories. They closed for a few years, they restarted them after the war finished. So I think we have to be very careful. I'm not saying all of the upper classes are of that opinion, but I would say a very large section of the upper classes are of that opinion. In terms of the CIA coup, I think the BBC document is a different one from the one I put a link, which Moshe had sent to me earlier, and I think I've added it as a link, and I'm adding it again. The BBC documentary had this story, which I'm not even sure does not even, I'm not even sure if it's true or not, but I will tell you what it is. The implication is that while the Shah had left Iran and was in exile, I think in Rome, the British ambassador gave him a message pretending this was from Queen Elizabeth, saying you should go back. The message was never from Queen Elizabeth. It was from a minister on the Queen Elizabeth ship going to the US. But this resulted in the Shah being under the impression that the British royals were supporting him. It's almost a non-story, but in some ways it shows his obsession with the British royal family. So I leave it at that. I do want to talk about the US before I finish two things. One is what Anne mentioned. So I think there is a very contradictory approach, both by the Soviet Union during Hojun, by the two factions of the Afghan government, and by Iran's pro-Soviet left in terms of Islamic legislation, women's rights, and so on. And this contradictory position has made the situation far worse. So they go with an aggressive attitude of let's attack Islam, let's make sure women remove their headscarf. In Afghanistan, they were forcing girls to go to school in villages where people didn't want to go to school. They face a reaction and somebody comes and says, oh no, we were too harsh on this. We have to do the exact opposite. And then they go the other way, but in an extreme way. So they tolerate Islam. Tudor party says there's no contradiction between Islam and us, and becomes followers of Imam Khomeini's political line. And the same is true in the Soviet Union. So I think that's the problem. You need to take a rational decision. You need to take a position that can mobilize people from below, not impose it from above, and then you can progress. But if you go from one extreme to the other, you're confusing your opponents, you're confusing your own supporters, and that is source for problem. Two final comments. One on Iran-Israel relations. I didn't say much about it, but anyone who has followed the Iran Gate scandal will know that Iran's Islamic Republic did accept a very complicated relationship between Israel and the United States. Funds were paid to Iran. I think around just before, just before the Beirut bombing, but maybe I've got that wrong. Anyway, and I think there are various other attempts at that. But of course, the one thing that the Islamic Republic can't give up, having given up on every slogan of the February uprising, the one slogan it's not giving up on is the question of Israel. It's, at least in words, it has to continue saying, we are for the Palestinian people. But Iran's relations with the US have been very complicated. And as I tried to explain, it's partly to do with the fact that the country has no other way of, if you like, the leadership has no claim to February except keeping this rhetoric. So you have slogans down with US, but at the same time, you see even clerics, as soon as they are on their day off, they are wearing t-shirts with US typed logos and US slogans and so on. They're not pro-US imperialism, but what I mean is the influence of the United States since the Shah's era in Iran and in the Middle East is considerable, and the Iranian clergy is not beyond that. And in fact, quite a lot of them, their main ambition or their main, the reason they steal all of this money, the corruptions they're involved, is to send money to US. So it's a very complicated relationship. And as I tried to explain on two very important occasions, the attack against Afghanistan, the attack against Iraq, Iran went out of its way to support US foreign policy. It was the United States that said, we don't want you because of the hostage taking, because of 1983 Beirut bomb. So you can see that there is a more, if you like, complicated story going on than just down with US. That's
Thank you, Yasmin. That's the end of this session. We reconvene at 4:30 when we have Mike McNair on growth, degrowth, and planning. Okay, thank you, comrades.